Good evening, everybody. Welcome, Excellencies, members of the Oxbridge Society and invited guests to another in our Singapore Oxbridge Society Fireside Chats. Part of a tradition going back to the 1950s of discourse, debate, and an engagement of ideas. Tonight's session is on the future of US-China relations. Has China won? With our distinguished speaker, Kishore Mahbubani. Kishore, welcome. A former president of the UN Security Council and distinguished academic and writer. Kishore, the topic is, has China won? Many say China has already won. For example, in the Middle East, China has shown a dexterity and flexibility to have full engagement with many Middle Eastern countries without any political cost. It was an ardent supporter of the Shah till the very end, and yet China is now the best friend and ally of the Ayatollahs. President Xi is the only major leader on the global stage who can, on the same official trip, visit both Jeddah and Tehran, two arch-enemy states, and be given a hero's welcome in each. China ardently supports the Palestinians at the UN, and at the same time, Israel has allowed it to buy key facilities in Haifa, from where China can spy on the US Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean. That's no surprise, of course, because China is Israel's biggest technology sharing partner in military equipment by some statistics. China is Saudi's biggest trading partner, and half of China's oil comes from the Gulf. And the sea lanes are kept open by the US Navy, paid for by the US taxpayer. And of course, now that it chooses the Chinese Navy, they're going to start escorting Chinese ships where they feel it's necessary. And and China, of course, now has a full deep water harbor in Djibouti. Yesterday's Straits Times ran two interesting stories, and it was quite pertinent. One was on Shenzhen. While the rest of the industrial world is on its knees, struggling with COVID and with negative GDP, China's got positive GDP, and President Xi was basking in the positive growth of Shenzhen and telling them what they had achieved over the last 40 years was just the groundwork of the next leap forward, where he was going to showcase the superiority of Chinese socialism with its entrepreneurship model against the failed liberal democracies of the West. To put it in context, you and I, Kishore, will, I'm sure, remember the fishing village of 40 years ago of Shenzhen, which had a GDP then of 30 million, and last year's GDP was US 400 billion. It's had the transformation from mud flats and paddy fields to metropolis, probably even more remarkable than that of Singapore's transformation. The Shenzhen Greater Bay Area is the California of Asia, vibrant, buzzing, but it trumps California because it also has a deep capital markets. The Shenzhen Stock Exchange is the second largest in the world. There's been exponential wealth creation, and last year Shenzhen's GDP growth was 20%. Maybe in 40 years' time, with the next leap forward that China's having, even Oxford and Cambridge may have to have our even songs specially sung in Mandarin for Chinese tourists. So the rest of the world should take note that Beijing can, in the same way as it's created in the greater Mekong area, replicate this in other parts of China. The other Straits Times story was in the life section of Mr. Mark Martin's family restaurant in Kansas, US, founded in 1870, which had survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the US economic meltdown of 2008. Serving heaps of healthy, hand-battered, I'm going to read this, fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and cream corn to 6 generations of devoted American healthy eaters, which alas closed on 25th September 2020. And that shock apparently was not surprising because 25% of small businesses in the USA have closed since the start of the year, and 40% of those remaining in the restaurant business say that they will close in the next 6 months unless the US government does more. So China we see one story. And the US, we see the polarization. We've seen anarchy in the streets, white supremacists, and of course, challenges over where the country is going. So Kishore, maybe the topic today should not have been has China won, but why America lost and what America can do to arrest its decline. Over to you, Chatham House rules. I hope this introduction has not sort of slightly thrown the cat among the pigeons, but that's the tradition of Oxbridge. Thank you, Kishore. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. That's a very interesting setup for a talk. I wonder if stones will be thrown at you if you walk into an American auditorium and just said what you just said. You may not come out alive, because you have actually no idea how strong the anti-China sentiment has become in the United States, and what may seem like a very reasonable, balanced statement by you will be read as a hostile, anti-American statement. And that's exactly why I agreed to do this talk for the Oxbridge Society, because what is very clear, and I have absolutely no doubt about it, is that we're going to see a great tragedy unfold over the next 10 to 20 years. The US-China geopolitical contest has begun, and it will get worse in the next 10 to 20 years unless we take decisive steps to do something about it. And here I believe that the people who should actually stop being passive about this US-China geopolitical contest are Singaporeans. And the reason why I say that Singaporeans have a special role to play is, number one, I have absolutely no doubt that as things get worse, Singapore will be squeezed. Singapore will be squeezed by China. Singapore will be squeezed by United States. And all I'm going to say is watch out. Things will get bad for Singapore. So the question is, what do you do? Do you do nothing? Or do you do something about it? And here I must commend our Prime Minister, because he's one of the few leaders who's been brave enough to both speak about it in the Shangri-La Dialogue last year in his opening speech and in the Foreign Affairs article he gave. But it's, I think, even more important for ordinary Singaporeans, or rather, to be fair, the extraordinary Singaporeans who studied in Oxford and Cambridge, to stop being passive and to say, ask what can you do about it. And there's one particular area where I think Singaporeans can play a very helpful role, because we are one of the few societies where the people can go to the United States and feel comfortable. They go to Harvard, Yale, they're very comfortable. But when they go to Beijing and Shanghai, they also feel comfortable. And in the divided world that is coming, there are very few people who can actually cross both cultures comfortably. And so we have therefore a special responsibility to explain to many of the Americans, for example, that the Chinese are not devils. They're not out to destroy the world. But that's becoming the consensus among even many thoughtful people in the United States. And so I think those who've actually studied in both cultures, in the Western and Chinese cultures, therefore have a special responsibility today to step up to the plate to prevent a tragedy from happening. And that's why I decided to give this talk. Now, let me try to explain why things will get worse. Firstly, I want to emphasize that the reason why this US-China geopolitical contest cannot be easily stopped is because it's driven by very deep structural factors. And there are at least three structural forces at play here. One is, and this is like a 2,000-year rule of geopolitics, whenever the world's number one emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's number one power, which today is United States, the world's #1 power always pushes down the emerging power, almost without exception. And Graham Allison, a friend of mine, a Harvard professor, has written an entire book, Destined for War, that documents it. I don't agree with this pessimistic conclusion that there'll be war, because I think in a nuclear war, you don't have a winner and a loser, you just have a loser and a loser. And so there won't be an outright war, but there'll be something short of that, including possible skirmishes in the South China Sea. The second structural force that's going to drive this geopolitical contest, and this is why I think Singaporeans have a special responsibility in this area, is that this geopolitical contest is not just driven by rational factors, but also driven by emotional factors. And this emotional factor is, of course, never mentioned in the United States because it's politically incorrect to speak about it. And this is what I call the fear of the yellow peril. This has been buried subconsciously in the Western mind for centuries. It's surfaced in literature like the Fu Manchu novels. It surfaced in the United States at the end of the 19th century when the US Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act to keep out Chinese migrants from the United States. And it is surfacing today. So when Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo, for example, refer to the China virus, Wuhan virus, the Kung flu, they are basically tapping into a rich emotional vein of anti-China sentiment that exists in the Western psyche. And this is exactly why I think Singaporean Chinese need to play a role in confronting this head on, because actually I do have Singaporean Chinese friends who have lived in New York for 30 to 40 years, and suddenly they find that people, when they walk on the streets, look at them very differently. For 30 years, they walk comfortably. Singapore Chinese spoke very good English, no problem. Now look at them, yellow peril. So and therefore I think Singaporean Chinese who think that they're going to be bystanders in this, watch out. You're going to be it too. And then the third structural force that's driving this is the fact that the Americans, and this is on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, feel disappointed that after having engaged China for so long, they thought that if the United States opened up China economically, China would then open up politically, then China would become a liberal democracy like America, and they would live happily ever after, right? And this is, by the way, confirmed in print by very high-level officials. Kurt Campbell from the Democratic side, a former Assistant Secretary of State for Asia Pacific, wrote an article in the magazine Foreign Affairs confirming this, as I cite him in my book, Has China Won? And then John Bolton in his recent memoirs also confirmed that both sides expected the China to become a democracy like United States. And of course, they got very disappointed that China hasn't become one. Which is why, by the way, it really doesn't matter whether Trump wins or Biden wins. There's actually a bipartisan consensus that this geopolitical contest should continue. But on this question of this American disappointment, I want as an aside to mention that future historians will be very puzzled by this American expectation, because when they look at it, they say, how is it a country with 1/4 the population of China, which is less than 250 years old, United States, could believe that it could transform a civilization that's 4,000 years old and make it like a 25-year-old country? I mean, that's the kind of historical arrogance that is also at play in this US-China geopolitical contest. But I want to add in another important point that while there are structural forces driving this contest is also driven by mistakes made by both sides. And I want to emphasize it's not a case of one side being the saint, the other side being the devil. Both sides have made mistakes in this contest. In the case of China, for example, I have devoted a whole chapter in my book to how China alienated the American business community, and that's a very important mistake, because until recently, whenever the U.S. government wanted to take action against China, the American business community would stand up and say, hey, stop, 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 stop. We got big business interests in China. So Boeing has sold over 1,000 planes in China. GM makes, General Motors makes more money from China than from United States. But what's interesting is that in the past, they always say, stop, stop, stop. But this time around, when Donald Trump launched his trade war in 2017, 2018, the American business community kept absolutely silent and didn't say a word, because they were angry and fed up at the way they were being treated in China. They felt that the intellectual property was being stolen, that the Chinese insisted on technology transfer before they allowed investments, and they got bullied by all kinds of officials in China. So what's interesting that there was almost, and that's why when Donald Trump launched his trade war, he found to his surprise that everybody was supporting him in the United States, the Democrats, the Republicans, and also the businessmen were happy to say, okay, go ahead, bash China. So that's a major mistake. And I also say there are other instances where the Chinese became very arrogant after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, and that arrogance surfaced in their behavior towards the Americans too. So that's the Chinese mistakes. But the United States has also made mistakes. And in the case of the United States, the guy who alerted me to the big mistake that the United States made was Henry Kissinger. At a one-on-one lunch with him in March 2018 in New York when I was doing research for this book, Has China Won? And at the end of the lunch, I got his permission to cite him in the book, saying that the biggest mistake the United States has made is that it has launched a geopolitical contest against China without having first worked out a comprehensive long-term strategy. And that, of course, is obviously a big mistake. And the question is, why didn't the Americans work out a strategy first? And by the way, incidentally, I also want to mention that when the Cold War began between the United States and Soviet Union, which is the last big contest that the United States had, it was actually guided by a major strategic thinker called George Kennan, who, even though he advocated a containment policy against Soviet Union, also advocated some very wise ways of managing the contest. First thing he said, the outcome of the contest will not depend on the bullets and bombs of each country, will depend on the spiritual vitality of the country, which country is doing a better job of taking care of its people. And clearly in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the United States is doing a much better job than the Soviet Union was in taking care of its people. So the United States enjoyed greater spiritual vitality in that sense. The second piece of advice that George Kennan gave is that cultivate friends and allies. The third piece of advice he gave is don't insult your adversary. And the fourth piece of advice he gave is be humble. And it's interesting, of these four pieces of advice, none has been heeded by the Trump administration in its handling of China. And the more fundamental issue here is that when the United States launched this contest against China, which enjoys bipartisan support, what's interesting is that the first question you normally ask when you launch a contest is, firstly, can America lose? And this idea is inconceivable. I mean, it's absolutely inconceivable. And that's exactly why I decided to choose the title, Has China Won? Because behind that title, there lurks another question, which is, can America lose? And most Americans cannot even conceive of the possibility of losing, because, I mean, the fact is the United States has won every contest it has got in over the last 130 years. It defeated Germany in World War I, defeated Germany and Japan in World War II. It sort of fought off the Japanese economic contest. It defeated the Soviet Union. So the United States is only used to winning. So it cannot conceive of the possibility of losing, which is why actually in some ways my book is a gift to the Americans, because the question I'm asking is, why don't you consider the possibility that you might lose? And here, one fundamental reason why the United States thinks it cannot lose is that they have a very strong ideological conviction that if you have a contest within a vibrant democracy in America and a rigid communist party system, democracies which are flexible, open societies will always defeat a dark, closed communist society. There's a total, absolute conviction of that. But what my book does is to dig deeper and say, is that really what the contest is between the United States and China? And the reality is that it is not. And the reason why it's not is that America used to be a very strong, dynamic democracy, but it has functionally become a plutocracy. So it used to have a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Now, as the Nobel laureate Joe Stiglitz documented in an essay in Vanity Fair, he says the United States is a society where the results are it's a government of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. And no, he's not the only one. Joe Stiglitz is left of center, but one of my good friends before he passed away was the most respected chairman of the Federal Reserve, probably the best chairman we had, Paul Volcker. And Paul Volcker has said, categorically, the United States has functionally become a plutocracy. And one result of the plutocracy is that all the new wealth and income is spread to the top 1%, 0.1%, and the bottom 50% have not seen any improvement for 30 years. And this is, again, the data is given in the book. And the result of that is that it's created a sea of despair among the white working classes. And this is, again, documented by two Princeton University economists, Case and Deaton, who talk about how this sea of despair has led to opioid addictions, led to suicides, led to tremendous suffering in American society. And I emphasize this because if George Kennan were alive today, he would look at that and say, hey, first we got to fix our own society first before we take on China. So if we don't take care of our own people, how can we win the contest against China? So and the reason I emphasize this also is that what is strange is that the Americans believe in the old adage, call a spade a spade. But even though America has become a plutocracy, even though Paul Volcker says it's become a plutocracy, Joe Stiglitz says it's become a plutocracy, Martin Wolf of Financial Times says it's become a plutocracy, neither the New York Times, nor the Washington Post, nor the Wall Street Journal will call United States a plutocracy. And this denial, of course, is very dangerous because unless you recognize there's a problem, you don't fix it. And that is the fundamental structural weakness that America is facing today. And then on the other side, in the case of China, what is surprising is that the Chinese Communist Party system has become one of the most meritocratic governments in the world in terms of selecting the quality of mind of people to serve and work in the Chinese Communist Party. So what the Americans see as a dark, oppressive force in Chinese society, the Chinese Communist Party, which is why you notice that nowadays when Mike Pompeo speaks, when Donald Trump speaks, they don't talk about the Chinese government, they talk about the Chinese Communist Party. But they forget that the Chinese Communist Party actually enjoys a tremendous amount of support and legitimacy in China. And I just give you two examples to drive home the point. The first one is that when I was in Columbia University in New York, again, on my sabbatical to do research for this book, Columbia University assigned to me a very bright young Chinese student from China as my research assistant. She was doing her master's program. So one day I was chatting with her over coffee, talking about her life and how she did in school. She said, well, I didn't do well in school. I graduated number 2. I said, number 2 is bad? Why is it bad? I thought it's very good, And she said, in China, only the number 1 graduating student gets admitted to the Chinese Communist Party. I was number 2. I didn't get in. I was heartbroken. Right? Later on, of course, she got in. She did well in university and she got in. But that's an example. When you take in the brightest young students all over China, you can well imagine the quality of mind of people in the government. And the second story, of course, is that the Harvard Kennedy School, the Ash Center of Governance, and where actually I did my sabbatical, just came out with a study showing that support for the Chinese Communist Party has been rising. And this is off the top of my head, you can please double check this. In 2013 is about 85%, now is about 93, 95%, and it's been steadily going up. And of course, from the point of view of the Chinese people, it's perfectly understandable why they support the Chinese Communist Party, because in comparison with the United States, where the past 30 years have been among the worst 30 years for the bottom 50% in maybe 200-300 years of American history, the past 40 years have been the best 40 years in 4,000 years for the Chinese people. And just today, I can tell you this, I was doing a Zoom call today with the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on China. And most of the members of the Global Future Council are Chinese, most of them are young, most of them are women. I had never met a group of women who were so sparkling, so amazingly optimistic, so driven. That's the kind of optimism you used to associate with the United States in the past. Now you see it in China among these young people. So therefore, this American idea that they cannot lose is a very, very strange notion. So that's why that's what I hope I can persuade the United States to do, to step back and think again before rushing headlong into the contest. But my last and final point is that the real goal, the thesis of my book, as I say, is a paradoxical one, which is a major US-China two-burger contest is inevitable. And I hope I've explained why it's inevitable and also avoidable. And in the chapter, my closing chapter, I end with what I call 5 non-contradictions between US and China. And I hope that US and China will focus on the 5 non-contradictions to try and ensure they can try and get along with each other, rather than try and destroy each other. So let me just mention 2 of the 5. The first one, of course, in this, I believe if George Kennan were alive today, George Kennan would agree with me. The first thing that the United States should focus on is not its primacy in the global system, but its people. Basically, the United States has got a strategic dilemma. Do we focus on primacy or do we focus on our people? And George Kennan would say, focus on our people. Let's take care of our people first. So if the bottom 50% in America are suffering, let's take care of them first before we go on to launch any geopolitical contests. And if the primary goal of the United States is to improve the well-being of its people, which it should be, and if the primary goal of China is to improve the well-being of its people, which it should be, they should be working together rather than against each other at this point of history. But the second non-contradiction, of course, is an important one, because what's happened is that the world has shrunk. And increasingly what we find is that most of the challenges today we face are global and not national. And if there's any doubt about it, COVID-19 has killed it. Clearly, why have we been locked up for the last, I don't know, I haven't been on a plane for 7 months now. Why? Because of a virus that has affected all corners of the world. So it's a common challenge. And it's one of the oldest rules of geopolitics is that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So since COVID-19 is an enemy of China and COVID-19 is an enemy of the United States, what they should do what Winston Churchill did in World War II, which is when he decided his primary enemy was Hitler and the enemy of Hitler was Stalin. Now, even though Stalin was a brutal dictator, Winston Churchill became the best friend of Stalin, because when you have a common enemy, you come together to fight the common enemy. And that's what the United States and China should do. But it's not just COVID-19. An even bigger challenge we face today is global warming. And there's no way any country can stop global warming. And certainly you cannot stop global warming. US and China don't cooperate. So in my very last page, the last image with which I leave in the book is that if the US and China keep fighting while global warming is happening, future historians will see them as 2 tribes of apes who kept fighting each other while the forest around them was burning. So I hope what we can do, all of us who are outside the United States and China, is to tell US and China, let's fix the burning forest before we continue with our fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Kishore. That's very interesting, very helpful. Many, many points, and the questions are coming in thick and fast. Can I just come back on 2 or 3 quick points that you made? The first is that America has never lost, and that's part of its problem that it faces. Well, it lost in Vietnam, and you know, they're still struggling to come to terms with that. And of course, they lost that the whole sort of domino effect that Kissinger talked about. The second is that you mentioned that America has always sensed that when it started its engagement with China, that the end game was a liberal democracy in China. Well, liberal democracies, the great liberal democracies and the most powerful ones of the world, America, India, Britain, have been the worst at handling COVID. They've been the most inept and they've had the biggest problems, whereas China, with its socialism and strong central government, has been able to keep its figures down remarkably. It's been the first to bounce back. And I think today we heard that WHO has said the Chinese vaccine is safe. They were also the first country. I mean, they were able to get a city with a few cases of COVID. An entire city of 7 million people were tested in 4 days. My son has had COVID in the UK. He had to wait 4 days for his test, and then finally got his results after 4 days. And he's got no access to any doctor. He just stays at home and takes Panadol and prays. So that's the difference between the liberal democracy system, the great liberal democracy systems, and socialism. So I don't know if that contest of ideology has really come to the fore again with COVID, because it's countries with strong central governments and without this liberal democracy sort of creating fissures in society that have been able to handle COVID in the most effective way. So Kishore, I fail to understand why the US thinks that when it engages with a country like China, that it expects the Chinese to then adapt to adopt an American liberal democracy. I mean, it never expected that of Russia. Russia will never be a liberal democracy.
Yeah, well, on the Vietnam War, that's a very good point you're making. But the Vietnam War was what they call one battle in the Cold War. And clearly the United States lost the battle. They had to flee Saigon somewhat ignominiously in helicopters from the American embassy. But at the end of the day, the United States won the Cold War handsomely because the Soviet Union, which was the main opponent in the Vietnam War, collapsed and disappeared. And what's even more interesting is that after the war ended and everything normalized, Vietnam is now one of the best friends of the United States, probably the best friend of the United States in Southeast Asia. So you always have these paradoxical outcomes, you know. And certainly, I think if Lee Kuan Yew were alive today, what he would say is that even though the United States lost the war in Vietnam, United States saved Southeast Asia. The dominoes did not become dominoes. And indeed, at the end of the day, quite remarkably, even though the Vietnamese denounced ASEAN as a neo-imperialist creation when it was founded, the Vietnam in the end of the day joined ASEAN. So you can see it's a very complicated story. But your second question is actually the more fundamental one about the performance of United States and China. And here I must say, I had an article in the economist.com, I think a few months ago, saying that what COVID-19 has shown is that the East Asian governments have been, for reasons we still do not know why, have been much more competent in their management of COVID-19. And just one statistic breaks it out. The number of deaths per million from COVID-19 in Europe are in the hundreds. Belgium, I think, is 800, France, the UK, and all of 600-700, and even the US, I think, 600. Whereas in East Asia, all the way, South Korea, Japan, China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and even Australia, New Zealand, it's less than 10. And this is a very puzzling figure, but it's a leading indicator of something. And certainly when it comes to COVID-19, there is now no question whatsoever that China has been competent in its management of COVID-19 and United States has been incompetent. Of course, what the Trump administration has been doing somewhat unfairly is to blame China and say China never revealed its statistics and so on, data and all that. But if you can read an essay written by Richard Horton, of the editor of Lancet magazine, one of the most prestigious, respected medical journals in the world, and he says on 23rd January, Lancet published 5 articles describing exactly what COVID-19 is, how dangerous it is, how there's person-to-person transmission, how there's no cure for it, how you need personal protection equipment, why you need ICUs to take care of the patients. And I hope your son doesn't have to go to ICU, I hope. But it is a very serious threat to the world. And Lancet published it on 23rd January. And surprisingly, Europe took no action till mid-March, and United States took no action till mid-March, but now they're blaming China. And so I'm sure this is something that the rest of the world can see very clearly. And so that's why it's very important for the rest of the world to speak up more and tell the United States very fairly and candidly, actually, you're doing badly because you made mistakes, not because of China. And that is just a simple fact. But by the way, if again, going back to your opening remarks, if you stand up in front of an American auditorium and just say a simple fact, actually you're suffering from COVID-19, not because of China, but because of your own incompetence, you'll be dead.
Kishore, and this is actually a very sorry and worrying concern, if that is indeed the case in the US. There are a lot of thinking people in the US and remarkable people, and it has been a remarkable society that with a tremendous ability to bounce back, and in the bounce back to lead others. We had Frank Lavin last month saying that he thinks 2021 is going to be a bumper year for the US economy, home run, and that Biden will probably reap the benefit. Of course, that was about 40 days ago. Whether what has now happened is going to help Trump in some way, who knows? But we've got so many questions. Let me take. There's a question from the Polish ambassador, Magdalena. 2 questions. What is the origin of US mistrust towards China? And what is the role of Singapore to explain the US way of thinking to China? Well, can we deal with the first? Because maybe in some ways, the Chinese actually have quite a lot of knowledge about the US way of thinking. But I think the second actually goes to a deeper point, which is whether Singapore has an interlocutor role. And paradoxically, that will then take us on to maybe, Kishore, another question where you said we're going to get caught and we're going to suffer. But we've seen Tencent coming here, Alibaba is here, TikTok is here. So, Chinese technology companies are now regarding Singapore as Asian regional headquarters, and they can rebadge and perhaps, see themselves in a different light. But can we answer the first of Magdalena's questions? What is the origin of US mistrust with China?
Sure. But just a quick comment on Frank Levin. I hope he's right. I want to emphasize that from Singapore's point of view, it's actually better to have a strong United States rather than a weak United States, and a strong China rather than weak China. It's actually not in our interest to see either United States or China weaken. So, and I hope that Frank Levin is right. And I hope that the United States will have a good year in 2021. On the question of US mistrust of China, I think it is as I explained in my remarks, that mistrust is traditional. Whenever somebody is emerging, you always see the emerging power as a threat, and you have to try in one way or another. If you're fighting a war, you've got to demonize the other. So, for example, in the Cold War, the Soviet Union was called the evil empire. And once you designate your opponent as the evil one, then you have the moral high ground, and that the same thing is happening vis-a-vis China. And that's why I highlighted the yellow peril dimension, because what I see increasingly and what I predict will happen increasingly is the demonization of China in the American body politic. And now, for example, frankly, let me ask you a simple question. Can you name one American politician who's now in office, not retired politicians? Retired ones can speak freely. Those who are in office who can stand up and say, stop, stop, let's take a balanced perspective on China. And nobody is doing it. And I have some of my best friends are the leading American scholars on China. And occasionally I've asked them privately, why aren't you writing more on China? Why don't you try and balance the debate? And this leading scholar said, Kishore, we cannot. If you try to say anything that is not condemnatory of China, you're toast. They call you a panda hugger, they call you, so that the mood has become very, very...
So you're not a loyal American if you're not a China basher?
Yeah, if
you can't be.
I mean, that especially if you want to run in office and so on and so forth. And you notice, even Biden, you know, this has got to show that he's tougher on China than Donald Trump is. Now, on the role of Singapore, as I explained in my very introduction, the best role that Singapore can play is a quiet one. But I think it's a mistake for Singaporeans to think it should just be done by the government. And I think if any of us has American friends, and this, of course, is you see this as a self-serving suggestion, mail them a copy of my book and say, why don't you see a different perspective on China? And the good news is that the more thoughtful Americans, after reading the book, have said, yes, thank you, you provide a perspective that you cannot get today in the United States. So Farid Zakaria, for example, made it the book of the week in his show, GPS show on Sunday, because he wants the Americans to hear a different point of view, not just a China bashing point of view. But the interesting thing you pointed out is about the entry of Tencent, Alibaba, TikTok, ByteDance. And it's good for the Singapore.
Well, Jack Ma has actually bought the house opposite mine.
Yeah.
So he's moving to Singapore as well.
Yes, but at the same time, I hope somebody in our government is watching this carefully, because I'm sure you heard in a battle, there's such a thing as collateral damage. Now, when the guns have already opened on Huawei, and I think we wisely decided not to choose Huawei, and the guns have now opened on ByteDance and TikTok, and ByteDance now has an office in Singapore. So watch out for collateral damage. And by the way, I don't think that Singapore therefore should be cowardly and not do anything. We clearly have to do something. We've got to stand up and defend our ground, but be ready. Be ready for all kinds of pressures. Now, you can either sit back and hope that everything will turn out for the best, or you can be proactive and try to persuade your American friends, hey, why don't you think again? And that's what I think the role of Singaporeans should be. Not the government, but the people.
Why should the Americans listen to us? Who do they listen to? I mean, do they listen to anyone?
Unfortunately, Paul, there are very few people in the world who are as articulate as you are in the English language. And the Americans find it quite amazing that when Singaporeans talk to them in English, they find that, wow, these guys can really speak English very well. So, and that's exactly why this is not something that, I'll give you an example that, let's say, Thailand can do, even though they have extraordinarily good diplomats, but the ordinary citizens in Thailand don't speak English. And certainly not something that the Indonesians can do. So this is something that Singapore can do. And you know, Singapore is a very unique city because it is the most westernized Asian city in the world by far. And so it is the only one that can effectively build bridges between China and the United States, and that actually in some ways.
Does China need us as an interlocutor? I mean, I mean, it was very interesting going back to the first question, Magdalena's question, at Davos. It must have been clearly intentional for President Xi to talk about Thucydides' trap. And he actually mentioned that at Davos, which I thought was pretty profound. And that was one of the questions that has come up from one of our speakers as well. So clearly, I mean, that was, you know, an apparent tendency to war when an emerging power threatens to displace the dominant power. So he knows exactly what it is, but wasn't he saying, frankly, we don't need to bother about you, America, and do you really think we need to care what you think? Is that what he was trying to say? Was that the subtext?
I think the Chinese care very deeply what the Americans think, and the Chinese are working very, very hard to try and diffuse the contest. I don't know whether he said it in Davos. I actually was in Davos in January 2017 when he gave his Davos speech. He may have been there, but I don't recall him being there. But I know he's referred to it because several times. Because he's basically, that was the reason why he referred to the Thucydides trap, is because that's the thesis of Grant Allison's book.
Exactly.
That we are destined for war. And basically Xi Jinping is saying that we are not destined for war. And he's trying his best to avoid a contest. But at the same time, Xi Jinping also cannot afford to be seen to be weak in the eyes of his own population. And I don't know whether you saw the piece I wrote in the Financial Times on 23rd September. I wrote an article saying that many Americans keep wishing that China will become democratic. I say be careful what you wish for, because if China had a democratically elected leader, he'd be far more nationalist than Xi Jinping. And in fact, he would take back Hong Kong and Taiwan immediately, because that's what 1.4 billion people in China want to see happen. And it will be a much rougher China we're dealing with. And in fact, in many ways, the Chinese Communist Party is delivering a global public good by bottling up Chinese nationalism. But these are the sort of points that I think Singaporeans need to make to their American friends, because I think many Singapore Chinese, as you know, and this is another thing that we are going to be very conscious of, is that the fault lines may start appearing in Singapore society, because there are Singapore
You really
Chinese.
think so? You really
Oh
think
yeah,
so?
of course they are appearing in Singapore society. Of course they are, because there are a whole group of Singaporeans and who actually are as angry as Chinese are about the American, what they consider to be unfair attacks on China. And I think it's very important for us, as I say, we should try to be helpful. We should be helpful to both sides, to both China and United States, and not get partisan in this contest. And I think our government, is trying its best to do that, but it's got to be sensitive to these.
It's a very difficult path to tread, Kishore. Sorry to interrupt you, but when we spoke up on the South China Sea, you know, it was a tall poppy syndrome. We were smacked down hard by our APCs being arrested in Hong Kong. So it's China has asserted the 9-dash line. That is a breach of international law as to some of what it's done in its reclamation policies and also in its militarization of what it's reclaimed. But that now seems to be a fait accompli. And American freedom of passage, which they're exercising in the South China Sea, is certainly something that, you know, we want. And so I suppose the concern really is, do you feel that if you have an American president who is not strong, and is not strident like Trump, that it would be hard to contain the inevitable Chinese total supremacy and hegemony in the South China Sea?
The South China Sea is actually a very complicated issue, and it's a mistake to see it in black and white terms. So number one, on the 9-dash line, I agree with you. The 9-dash line has no basis in international law. But what we should do is, instead of trying to condemn China publicly, I think we should talk to China privately. And this is what I've tried to do several times. And fortunately, at least in private, Chinese scholars agree with me that if China today is the world's #1 trading power, far ahead of the United States, is actually China has a greater interest in freedom of navigation as a great power than the United States does. And by the way, paradoxically, when the US Navy keeps international sea lanes free, the US Navy is keeping international sea lanes free so that Chinese products can go safely to Africa and Latin America. So it's the US Navy that's facilitating all this. So, and when it comes to South China Sea, by the way, China does not object to freedom of navigation in the South China Sea at all. The US Navy can go through it, all navies can go through it. Of course, the one fuzzy area, of course, is that they have reclaimed land on some territories, and under international law, frankly, and they were not the first to start it, by the way. Unfortunately, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines started reclaiming land, and they thought they would have a one leg up over China. But of course, the Chinese said, okay, you reclaim, I reclaim. And so, but the Malaysians can reclaim 20 acres, the Chinese can reclaim 2,000 acres, a different scale completely. And these are the areas. So in the case of the South China Sea, the chapter that I have in my book, I begin the chapter by saying that the Financial Times, the Economist, the New York Times, all accused President Xi Jinping of lying when he offered to demilitarize the South China Sea islands. But I say in my book that it is a fact that President Xi offered to demilitarize the islands. It is a fact that China subsequently militarized the islands. But in between, what happened was that when President Xi Jinping made the offer to President Obama to demilitarize the South China Sea islands, the United States didn't accept that offer. And Ambassador Stapleton Roy, one of the best US ambassadors to China, told that to me again in a one-on-one conversation in Washington, D.C., and he allowed me to cite him in my book saying that. So the problem is that there was an opportunity to solve the South China Sea issue, and it was not taken. And so the point is, if you try, the question is, do you want to try and work out a win-win deal with China, or do you want to humiliate China? Right now, the South China Sea was a wonderful thing for humiliating China. But of course, you're going to humiliate China and South China Sea. China is not going to compromise. But if you want China to compromise, then you talk to them privately and try and work something out. Singapore, by the way, is not a claimant state. And we are fortunate in that sense because all the claimant states are going to have a very challenging time in the South China Sea.
Many questions, and we've only got 7 minutes more. Melissa Lee, under Trump, the US has become dysfunctional. What is the possibility of Biden resetting relations with China to be more collaborative rather than combative? Same question from Leanne. And then another, actually, we've got so many people dialing in from around the world. Kishore, you'd be interested. Here's Ilkka Kivisaari from Helsinki, who's the head of Temet, one of the big Finnish defense companies that builds nuclear shelters. Isn't the worst case scenario that if Biden wins, Trump refuses to accept the election results and soon there'll be blood on the streets? They may not even need China's help to lose.
Well,
and then one, can I just also, and one from the Norwegian ambassador, Anita Nagard. with the mounting US-China tension, increasing pressure being placed on third countries by both of them, will it be possible for Singapore and ASEAN to continue to avoid choosing sides going forward? Well, maybe we answer that in the context of Singapore, because ASEAN, of course, doesn't necessarily speak with one voice, and within ASEAN there are different factions.
Well, on the first question about, I hope that if Trump, number one, I hope that Trump loses. I think as an analyst trying to follow international relations,
Okay.
it's so exhausting trying to follow him, because he can tweet, change, and then you haven't caught his latest tweet. You don't even know what his position is on something. And if you got to speak about United States, you got to follow all his tweets and follow him. It's been very exhausting. So I think life will go back to normal under
So Kishore,
Biden.
when you send me your book and sign it, please say in it, I hope Trump loses, and I hope one day to meet Trump and I'll show it to him.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
But one of the questions is right. There's a danger that Trump may not accept the result. That's a possibility. But of course, that's only a possibility if there's a very close win by Biden. But if he wins by a landslide, and there's some indications that he might win by a landslide, then I think there's no question whatsoever that Trump will go. But it doesn't mean that if Biden wins, the US-China political contest is over. It's not over at all. I mean, I guarantee you that President Joe Biden will be much more courteous to the Chinese. He won't be insulting to the Chinese as president. But nonetheless, the contest will continue. And so, that's why it's actually very important for us to speak to some of us. I have some friends that are close to Biden, so I stay in touch with them in the hope that I can try to sort of pass some ideas to them. But I think it's important for us to reach out to them also. On ASEAN, by the way, I don't think we should rule out ASEAN at all. ASEAN has a very, very important role to play. And frankly, the reason why I wrote my book, The ASEAN Miracle, is that ASEAN is truly, genuinely a miracle. And ASEAN can provide a very valuable buffer to both US and Chinese pressure, especially for Singapore. And it is true that some ASEAN countries are very pro-American, like Vietnam. It is true that some ASEAN countries are very pro-China, like Cambodia and Laos. But that's normal. You can have different perspectives. But the question is, can we still get along with each other? And actually, it's quite amazing that ASEAN has shown a very high degree of resilience. And one of the key arguments I make in my book is that both the United States and China should decide that it is in their national interest not to see ASEAN destroyed. And that is a key message that we should make to both United States and China. Don't apply pressure on ASEAN. If ASEAN breaks apart, both US and China would also lose. And I fortunately, as of now, touch wood, both the US and China understand that it is in their interest for ASEAN to hang together.
How can Singapore stay relevant to China? We are different Singapore, and China's, actually more importantly, China's a very different China from when Deng Xiaoping visited in '78 and saw Singapore as a miracle and learned a lot from here.
Yeah, well, I think I don't have the statistics off the top of my head, but I think the Chinese GNP in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping visited Singapore, I mean, my rough guess, maybe 3-4 times the size of Singapore, right? This is a rough guess. Please don't hold me to this, okay? 3-4 times, 5 times, whatever it is. Today, the Chinese GNP is $14 trillion. Singapore's is about $300 billion, right? So they are at least 40 to 50 times the size of Singapore. So can you imagine? They were 4 to 5 times as big as us. Now they're 40 to 50 times bigger than us. So clearly the
It
relativity.
may end up being 400 times as big in the next 40 years.
Yeah, and the relativity between Singapore and China has changed dramatically. And also at that time, we had exceptional leaders. Okay, so I mean, I had the great privilege and pleasure of working with the three of the best geopolitical masters in the world: Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam. All three of them, by the way, were very highly respected in China, very highly respected. And so for a small country, we had tremendous access and influence in China, and we played a very valuable role on Taiwan and so on and so forth. But I think now things have changed, and it is quite natural, Frank. And you know, when I mentioned earlier, one of the mistakes that the Chinese have made is that they become arrogant. Frankly, they've also become quite arrogant vis-a-vis Singapore. And their view is, whatever you can do, we can do better now. And in some ways they have. I mean, even like managing COVID-19 and vaccines and everything. So China is a remarkable. So so for us, but the good news is that they still like and respect Singapore, and they realize that Singapore can be useful. But it's a different relationship. It's not the same as what we had in '78, and we've got to learn to manage a very different China.
Kishore, Kwok Kun Hong yesterday listed his Chinese edible oil companies in Shenzhen. So I come back to Shenzhen for 2.8 billion. So there must be opportunities for our private businesses. Maybe our businessmen should be leading the charge in calibrating our relationship with China, because clearly China seems to think that our businessmen who make money from their own money, not using taxpayers' money at Temasek, for example, seem to be successful and making fantastic home runs. So clearly there's a role for Singapore and Singapore businesses in China. Taiwan has come up repeatedly. Have you got a minute to just tell us about Taiwan and where things are going to go?
If there's one issue on which China will go to war, it's Taiwan. And only because if a Chinese leader is seen to be weak on Taiwan, he'll be killed by his own people. So the Chinese leaders are against the war. So actually, to be fair to China, the Chinese leaders have been quite surprisingly restrained, even though the Trump administration has basically violated many of the understandings of the One China policy that were actually negotiated by Kissinger and Brzezinski and others. And here it is very, very unwise for United States to do that, because I mean, in my book, I tell the story that in 1961, President John F. Kennedy, a very influential global figure, and Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, a very influential global figure, wrote a joint letter to an Anglophile Prime Minister called Jawaharlal Nehru and said, "Don't take Goa, you know, keep it, let the Portuguese run it." I think Nehru threw away the letter and took back Goa and said, "Goa belongs to us." So I think the attitude of China basically is Taiwan is part of China. It was separated because of the century of humiliation. Actually, it's quite amazing that I haven't mentioned the phrase century of humiliation in my 1 hour dialogue with you. If there's one thing that we can do is to educate Americans about the century of humiliation, because it's a major driving force in China's attitudes towards the rest of the world. So I'm now working on a multiple open online course on US-China relations based on my book. It should be released by edX in January. But I make it a point to have 3 videos on the China century of humiliation, because if you don't understand the century of humiliation, you don't understand why they feel so strongly about Taiwan, and you don't understand why they would go to war with Taiwan.
Thank you. Well, I hope on that note, which is a slightly worrying note, but that good sense will prevail, and that at some future date, Kishore, we can have you back, looking back in with a lens maybe 2 years from now, and and see how the world has continued to function with challenges. Let's hope that good sense prevails, and that in the next 2 years that we will next year at least see an uptick in the US economy. I think if the US economy is doing well and things going well for them domestically, then some of the angst and the tensions and the need to be China bashing will abate somewhat. And let's hope for that, because that's possibly the best way to get America to reappraise its relationship with China. It's very interesting that you shared with us that if not for socialism, Chinese nationalism would be far stronger. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think that was a very interesting key takeaway. Also that China offered to demilitarize and that Obama did not react. But China, I've had a comment, the very first one that came up on the Q&A, that I was totally wrong and that China is dominant, hegemonist country seeking to dominate the world. Some say it's seeking a rebalance. Do you think China wants to dominate and be the global power, or does it want to rebalance? Final question.
Well, the good news is that China has no desire to step into the shoes of the United States and become a global hegemon, because the Chinese don't understand why the Americans, you know, in your introduction, you spoke about the many wars that the United States had got involved in the Middle East. And the Chinese keep scratching their heads and said, why are the Americans fighting these wars in the Middle East? Now, the most important statistic that any American should know, when I talk about the bottom 50% of Americans not seeing any improvement in their standard of living, America has spent $5.1 trillion on post 9/11 wars since 2001. The last 20 years, they spent $5 trillion. If instead of burning $5.1 trillion in the Middle East, if they had taken the money and given it as cash checks to the bottom 50%, each citizen of the bottom 50% would have received a check for $30,000. And by the way, by contrast, the United States has basically been at war every year for the last 40, 50 years. And this is President Jimmy Carter who says this, by the way. But China actually has not fought a war in 40 years since the war with Vietnam. So the Chinese don't have the kind of messianic desire to run the world. For them, running China, keeping China together every day is a huge achievement. And they want to focus on that. Of course, that doesn't mean, by the way, that China will not behave like a bully. China will be a bully because all great powers are bullies. The idea of a benevolent great power is an oxymoron. There's no such thing as a benevolent great power. If you're a great power, you're a bully. And if you're a regional power, you're a bully. So, and that's a reality that of geopolitics, and you got to learn to manage that. But the Chinese certainly will not go send out forces to fight wars in Syria or Iraq or Libya. And as far as they're concerned, frankly, since the Chinese think strategically and long term, all these wars, US wars in the Middle East, have been geopolitical gifts to China. And I can tell you, if the Trump administration has started a war against Iran, the Chinese would have popped the champagne and said, good, now we get 10 more free years. So all these wars by United States are basically geopolitical gifts to China. And so as I say, I tell my American friends, I'm your friend, I'm telling you, why are you doing this? These are all gifts to China.
Thank you, Kishore. We started, funnily enough, in my introduction at the Middle East. We've gone around the world and ended up back in the Middle East. I know you've got another session. Thank you for giving us 8 minutes into the next session. We look forward to seeing you soon. Kishore, I look forward to your book. I'll send you my book on He Saved Thousands, on my father. And let's catch up sometime. Thank you all who've dialed in from around the world. We've had so many of you. I've seen Canada, I've seen Finland. I'm sure there are many from the UK who are in. Some Chinese names I see on the list as well. So fantastic. Thank you, Kishore. I think there may have been, what, 70, 80 people on this from around the world. So it's been a good dialogue. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.